Morning. So, I was thinking about tabletop RPGs, actually. So things like Dungeons and Dragons, role-playing games like that. And it's probably pretty unusual for, I don't know, somebody in my line of work, I guess, that there's not a whole lot of overlap in that Venn diagram between police officers and people who play Dungeons and Dragons. But I have trained a number of recruits who've had, I guess, various interests. I was talking with one not too long ago just about, I think he was really into Star Wars, and just how it was easier, I think, as you get older to kind of not be, embarrassed or awkward about the things that interest you. And, especially when your time is, increasingly finite as you accumulate more responsibilities as you get older, and so that, the time you have here and there to spend on hobbies and trivial things is extremely limited. But just thinking about tabletop RPGs and kind of role-playing generally, I think it's not just a trivial activity. Now, if you want to kind of clad role-playing generally with the, fantasy trappings of a, kind of Lord of the Rings-esque setting, there's a certain amount of frivolity, I guess you could say, associated with that. But I think there's actually, just mechanically some really valuable things that you can derive from role-playing. It kind of reminds me of, there was a documentary years ago I watched called Darkon. I think it's on YouTube. You don't have to pay for it. But it's about live action role-playing, or LARPing for the uninitiated, which is just a very silly pursuit for adults. Tabletop RPGs with, again, fantasy elements are exceedingly silly to begin with, which is okay. You shouldn't take yourself too seriously. But Darkon and live action role-playing are exceedingly silly, which I'm not dumping on people who LARP. If that's your gig, then, go for it, have fun, do what you want. And if you got, a group of people or even a large community who are, like-minded and enjoy doing those things, and, more power to you. I'm not here to judge. It's not my thing, necessarily, although I find it fascinating. And if you haven't watched the documentary, I'd encourage you to do so. So, generally speaking, live action role playing, you have people dressing up like they're fantasy characters in various, degrees of quality, and as far as, costume and equipment goes. There's rules to the game, so to speak, just like there is with, any tabletop RPG. But largely, especially LARPing or live action role playing, it's really about the role player getting into your character, which is really all it is, kind of like improv acting. And you've got a character with a backstory, and you're trying to think about that character's thoughts and motivations, and put yourself in their shoes, and behave in a way that would be consistent with that character's personality. Which, again, it's silly, and so watch the documentary, it's fun. But setting that bit of it aside, I was thinking about, like I said, training, and we do tabletop exercises in a work context. I've done them when I was fighting wildfires, and I mean, at the, kind of small fly-by-night company I worked for in Central Oregon. I mean, it wasn't, a federal thing. It was just a contract crew that did disaster relief stuff and, wildfire incidents and other things like that. But they had a big sandbox. And little kind of micro machine sized tender trucks and bulldozers and pickups and things like that to kind of stand in as all the vehicles that might be coming to an incident, and you could move the sand around just like you would for lots of other things, and kind of create terrain and have a scenario, and then just think through a problem, which is a lot of where the value is in role-playing generally. It was funny as I was getting into law enforcement, and I didn't do Dungeons and Dragons growing up. I got introduced to it in college, and in my youth, Dungeons and Dragons was a dirty word, and there was still kind of the sort of moral panic about it, and people having notions about it being some sort of like satanic ritual or associated with that, which it's silly if you understand the mechanics of how it works. It's silly to believe that. Now, I don't want to dump on people's deeply held and profound spiritual beliefs, but again, bear in mind that there's practical exercises that professionals do to engage in simulated problem solving, which is really all tabletop role playing is. Even going through the hiring process when I was new in law enforcement, and you have these oral boards or these panel interviews, so you've got a number of officers at the agency who ask you a variety of questions, and there was a role-playing exercise that we did in the oral board that I did as an applicant. And they give you a scenario, and you're like, on patrol, even though you don't know anything about patrolling because you're an applicant. You see some wanted suspect. What do? And really, that's not all that different from what Dungeons and Dragons is. It's just pointy elf-eared or dwarf beard on the guy with the warrant, or the cop with the patrol car. And now you got Dungeons and Dragons. Give them swords instead of guns, and that's the only difference, right? What do? You present somebody with a situation, a moral quandary. What do? In a role-playing fantasy sense, what would your character do consistent with, whatever contrived backstory you have, or, personality traits that you're, kind of trying to roll with that you find interesting. And variously in other contexts in law enforcement, done role-playing, even live action role-playing. When I went through Academy, they have a scenario village in the agency I work at. Now we have a large training center with a scenario village in it. And as a survival skills, defensive tactics and firearms instructor, I'm often a role player, and that's what we call it, in scenario-based training for, deputies in training, or, in-service training for people who are already certified staff, and they're just having periodic update training, and it's fun. It kind of scratches that acting itch a little bit anyway, but you have rather than a Dungeons and Dragons manual, just a course syllabus and a brief outline of scenario. And then you draw upon whatever personal experiences you have to flesh out this character that you're going to embody. So, if you are a, emotionally disturbed individual with mental health issues, who's got suicidal tendencies. If you've experienced and encountered individuals like that, which, honestly, if you work in law enforcement any amount of time, you're going to run into a whole lot of that. You kind of have an idea what that looks like. And maybe even you pull out little tidbits from individuals that you encountered. Like, I won't use the name, but there's an individual I used to run into fairly often, and former coworkers, if you're watching this, you'll maybe recognize the description, but anytime I was driving around, I saw him, and he was always kind of, beating around on foot, and he'd try to wave you down frantically, and of course, if you stopped and talked to him, he always had this story about how the Hells Angels were using black magic to, physically harass him, and, it was such a weird combination of things, like Hells Angels, black magic, and, there's one time it's like, guy, what do you want me to do about that? I mean, like, I don't do black magic. Like, you need like a shaman or a priest or something, right? Like, what do you want me to do? But he always wanted to, like, he felt like they were, trying to find him, because they had, a bounty on him or something. I don't know, but you could take little tidbits like that and, and weave that into whatever you're doing, in like a role-playing exercise, or, when I went through the academy, you had people who were, master's level mental health clinicians there helping facilitate training to, again, deal with, people with mental health issues. And again, there's this deep, background experience that they can draw upon to create realistic training scenarios, right? And a lot of the scenarios that you do, these training scenarios, are based on, real experiences of one kind or another that, officers have had to deal with. And, it's really, useful training because it is, highly realistic. It's based on actual events, and the lessons that those senior and experienced officers learn can be, beneficial to new people, so that new folks aren't making their own mistakes, but they're learning from the mistakes of others, and, hopefully end up a little bit ahead of the curve. And we get this constant refinement in, best practice and how we go about handling things. And you kind of build this institutional knowledge around, just how things are done based on, these basically just, common stories that we tell each other, or even act out in kind of a role-playing context. And I actually feel that having played Dungeons and Dragons in college was beneficial for me in my professional development, because it helped me to think in that way. And, everybody's got, various levels of personal attributes and skills and, gifts that they can draw upon, and that makes them better or worse problem solvers. But, adding just that one more tool to the tool chest, so to speak, of, having, played Dungeons and Dragons, sat at the tabletop and thought through, a verbally described scenario and, trying to, problem solve on the fly that way. It's a really useful exercise. And I referenced that documentary Darkon, like one of the main characters in the kind of narrative, and it is a documentary, but they kind of make a narrative out of it based on some events that are happening in the game. And one of the main characters is kind of the antagonist, is actually like this kind of really successful kind of corporate type person who, again, like, role-playing and the LARPing, like, it was kind of the foundation of how they learned to interact with people and think creatively, and creatively problem solve on the fly, and that became really a source of inspiration and professional development for them as they matured into a career. And so the protagonist is kind of this doofy quasi like stay-at-home dad type character who's not terribly successful, and is kind of like trying to lead this uprising against this kind of antagonistic character, like in the world of Darkon, but also like there's like the interpersonal conflicts like between them as well. I don't know. It's a fascinating documentary. Like I said, if you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to go find it. It's not terribly long, but it's funny. Like cringy often at times, but it's entertaining to watch, especially if you have done any tabletop exercise. I kind of think about sometime, like I've got a training that I'm helping facilitate next week, and just talking about role playing, and I'm constantly tempted to like surreptitiously introduce Dungeons and Dragons into some police training without people like really realizing what they're doing, right? I'm not sure how that would be received or go over, but I think it'd be terribly funny. And like I just have training scenarios based on real experiences, but also kind of introduce some variability in the success or failure of decisions that somebody makes in a given scenario using dice rolls, and that's kind of the kind of chaotic element to Dungeons and Dragons, which really gives it a lot of its charm, right? You've got these polyhedral dice or many-sided dice beyond the kind of standard 6-sided dice, again for the uninitiated here. Everything from a 20-sided dice down to a 4-sided die, and depending on what you're trying to do, you roll one of these die and add a kind of plus or minus modifier based on whether you're proficient in doing whatever you're attempting to do, or how difficult the thing you're attempting to do is, and then kind of based on the outcome, the dungeon master or the game master, or basically the rules referee who's facilitating the scenario, looks at the dice roll and kind of sort of weaves that into the narrative as far as how significant the success or failure in the attempted action was, and so you deal setbacks to the characters or the players as the game master or the dungeon master with these dice rolls. I mean, it's something that somebody might be really skilled at, like shooting a bow. You could have a critical failure, and something that would have been otherwise a simple task for them to do suddenly creates a new problem that you have to, again, think on the fly and adjust and come up with a new plan, and then try to work your way through it. And I mean, sometimes it works really well, sometimes things fail spectacularly, but if you got a kind of a good group of people going through either a tabletop exercise in a professional sense, or playing a tabletop role-playing game, what you end up with is this kind of cooperative problem-solving exercise, and also an emergent narrative that can be really entertaining, in the same way that it can be really entertaining to see how new recruits struggle through a familiar scenario that they're presented with, right? So we have these drills we'll do, and again, trying to kind of keep things vague, but basically there's certain set scenario drills during a new hire academy that everybody does, and they're these same learning points that everybody has to kind of pass through, and again, it's this common narrative that on the one hand we all share, but on the other hand you get to see variations in how the story plays out based on who's playing the role of, the deputy, the primary responding deputy in a given scenario, right? And sometimes it's hilarious to see, people just struggling through problems, which are new and unfamiliar to them, but are, very familiar to you as the instructor or the, role player in the scenario. It's a lot of fun. And it's something I think a lot of professionals could incorporate into what they do more often. Whether in, kind of a more formal setting, like I said, we've got this big scenario village and it's, furnished and we have costumes and props and all sorts of things. And I mean, it can turn into quite the production. Or even, when I'm training somebody one-on-one, and there's an area they're maybe particularly weak in, even if something simple as having conversations with somebody and role-playing the interaction, right? There's times when I'm this close to kind of convincing one of my recruits that I'm a psychic, right? I mean, not really, I joke, but because there are certain calls for service, which I have serviced many, many times, and anybody who's, in the profession will recognize what I'm talking about, and I mean, no two calls are exactly the same, but you definitely see common themes. And so I'll see a call come up in the queue on the computer, and have a pretty good guess about how it's going to go, right? And if it's something that's like just super new and unfamiliar for a recruit, and we'll kind of talk about, well, what do you think you should do, based on what we have and what's your plan, and maybe it's a good plan or a bad plan. Like, all right, well, let's say you do that, and I'll pretend to be, your caller, with this whatever problem, my neighbor trimmed my bushes or whatever, and I'm upset with him and I want you to come arrest him, and you be you, and I'll kind of pretend to be your caller and react as I think she would based on previous experience, and we'll see how that goes, right? And so they kind of get a first pass at the problem, again, thinking through it in this kind of active role-playing exercise, and then, once they do it for real, they'll, kind of see, like, maybe we could predict some of these outcomes based on, previous experience, or just, kind of rational, intuitive thinking, and B, our plan, that we thought we were going to implement didn't work so well, so we maybe changed it for when we did it for real, and that actually worked much better, and we were able to anticipate some problems, and maybe something else new came up and we needed to think on the fly and adjust our plan and move forward. But role-playing, like, even in an informal one-on-one training scenario, is just super valuable, and something I'll do, again, without the dice and the dwarves and the elves in it, and the orcs or whatever else, but it's not really all that different. And so I guess I would say, like, if you've heard of Dungeons and Dragons and you thought that's like something for weirdos and nerds, like, you're not wrong. I'll own it. I'm a weirdo, I'm a nerd, I enjoy it. But don't write it off all the same. Like, I'm not saying you have to go out and start playing Dungeons and Dragons. If it's not something that interests you or you're uncomfortable with, by all means avoid it. But I mean, the concept of role-playing in general, there's a lot of value to be had there. And if you've ever heard of it and haven't played it and find yourself intrigued, like, there are groups at your local hobby shops who are playing games all the time, and in general, the folks that do play Dungeons and Dragons are always looking for more people, and tend to be pretty open and accepting to new people, and will actually go way out of their way to help you get over the learning curve of some kind of new hobby. And if you're a close personal friend of mine and you ever want to play, let me know, because it's fun. Anyway, that's all I got. Inspiring and uplifting as always. It's been fun. We'll see you on the next one.